The midnight caller Sarah had always been independent. At 17, she was responsible enough to stay home alone when her parents traveled. It wasn't the first time they had left her in charge, and she had never minded. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. But that night felt different. Her parents had left in the afternoon for a weekend trip, reminding her to lock the doors and call them if she needed anything. She assured them she'd be fine. The house was cozy, and she had planned a relaxing weekend, watching movies, eating snacks, and staying up late. She was looking forward to it. But as night fell, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. Every little creak in the floor or rustle of leaves outside made her uneasy. It was strange because she had been home alone before, and nothing like this had ever bothered her. Still, she brushed it off. Maybe she was just overthinking. She tried to distract herself by watching a comedy, but even the cheerful voices on the screen didn't help. She kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something or someone outside. But there was nothing, just the darkness pressing against the glass. By midnight, she was starting to feel tired. Just as she was about to turn off the TV and head to bed, her phone rang. The screen showed blocked number. Her stomach twisted. She hesitated before answering. Hello? For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then, a deep, raspy voice whispered, I see you. A shiver ran down her spine. She immediately hung up, her hands trembling. It had to be a prank. Maybe one of her friends messing with her? But deep down, she wasn't sure. The voice didn't sound familiar. She tried to shake it off. Maybe if she ignored it, whoever it was would stop. But a few minutes later, her phone rang again. The same blocked number. This time, she didn't answer. She let it ring, her heart pounding. When it finally stopped, she exhaled, trying to calm herself. But almost immediately, it rang again. She grabbed the phone with shaky hands and pressed the answer button. She didn't say anything, hoping whoever it was would get bored and hang up. Instead, she heard breathing. Then, the voice chuckled softly and whispered, I see you. Terror gripped her. She hung up and quickly locked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Then, she tried calling her parents, but their phones went straight to voicemail. Panic started to rise in her chest. Taking a deep breath, she dialed 911. A calm voice answered, asking what was wrong. She explained everything, the strange calls, the voice, the feeling that someone was watching her. The dispatcher reassured her. We're sending an officer to check the area. Stay inside, keep the doors locked, and don't open them for anyone until the police arrive. She nodded, even though they couldn't see her. Okay, thank you. After hanging up, she sat on the couch, gripping her phone tightly. She kept her eyes on the windows, her ears straining for any sound. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. Then she heard it. A soft tapping at the window. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head. A dark figure stood just outside the glass, staring at her. She let out a scream and bolted from the couch, running down the hall. She locked herself in the bathroom, her heart hammering against her chest. She pressed her back against the door, trying to steady her breathing. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Then, silence. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the police to arrive. Every second felt like an hour. Then, suddenly, she heard sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed through the window. A voice called out, Police! If anyone's inside, come out with your hands up. Sarah didn't move at first. She was too afraid. But then she heard knocking at the front door and a firm voice calling her name. Gathering her courage, she unlocked the bathroom door and slowly made her way to the front. A police officer stood there, looking concerned. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was. I, I think someone was outside my window." The officer glanced around before stepping inside. "We found your back door slightly open. There were footprints in the mud leading into the woods." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Did you catch him?" The officer shook his head. "Whoever it was, they were gone by the time we got here." Fear settled deep in her bones. The idea that someone had been that close, watching her, possibly even trying to get inside, made her feel sick. The police stayed for a while, checking the area and making sure she was safe. They advised her to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and call them if anything else happened. They also said they would patrol the area throughout the night. After they left, Sarah sat on the couch, hugging her knees. She didn't sleep that night. Every sound made her jump. She kept replaying the events in her head, wondering what would have happened if she hadn't locked herself in the bathroom. The next morning, she called her parents. They were horrified and promised to come home as soon as possible. Sarah felt relieved, but the fear didn't leave her. Even with the daylight streaming through the windows, the house no longer felt safe. Days passed, and the police never found the intruder. There were no more calls, no more tapping at the window. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. Every time she walked past a window, she felt eyes on her. Every time she heard a noise at night, she held her breath, waiting. To this day, she still wonders. What if she had answered the door? What if she hadn't locked herself away? And the most chilling question of all, would he ever come back? The hidden room Jacob had always wanted to live in an old house with history. So when he found a Victorian-style home on sale at a low price, he couldn't believe his luck. The house was big, with tall windows, wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and a grand staircase that led to the upper floors. It had a charm that modern houses lack. But as soon as he moved in, he sensed something strange about the place. The air felt heavy, as if the house held onto old secrets. Sometimes he heard faint noises, whispers, footsteps, or the sound of doors closing on their own. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just the house settling. Jacob wasn't afraid. He had always liked a little mystery. The previous owner had disappeared years ago, which added to the eerie atmosphere. The locals refused to talk about it. Every time he asked, they changed the subject or gave vague answers. Some warned him to leave, but he didn't believe in ghost stories. Days passed, and Jacob grew used to the odd noises. But one evening, while exploring the attic, he found something unusual. A bookshelf stood against the far wall, covered in dust and filled with old books. When he reached for one, the entire shelf moved slightly. Curious, he pushed it aside and found a small door behind it. It was locked. His heart pounded with excitement. A secret door. He ran downstairs, grabbed a screwdriver, and pried it open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a dark, windowless room. Jacob stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and something else, a faint, metallic scent. He reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The walls were covered in old newspaper clippings. As he scanned them, his excitement turned to unease. Every article was about missing people. The dates spanned decades. Some clippings were yellowed and fragile, others newer, as if someone had continued collecting them. In the center of the room stood a single chair. At first, it looked ordinary, but as he stepped closer, he saw straps on the arms and legs. His stomach twisted. Who had used this room? And why? A sudden creak behind him made him spin around. The attic was empty, but he felt as if someone or something was watching him. He backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. His hands trembled as he pushed the bookshelf back into place. That night, he struggled to sleep. Every sound in the house felt louder, closer. He heard whispers, footsteps, and the unmistakable creak of a door opening. But when he checked, no one was there. The next morning, something strange happened. A newspaper lay on his doorstep. He hadn't subscribed to one. He picked it up and unfolded it. The headline made his blood run cold. Missing man found dead near Victorian home. The picture below the headline showed a man he had seen before in one of the newspaper clippings from the hidden room. Panic set in. He didn't want to stay another night in the house. He packed a bag, grabbed his keys, and left. He didn't care about losing money on the house. He just wanted to be far away. As he drove off, he glanced at the house one last time. In one of the upstairs windows, he thought he saw a shadow. A tall figure standing perfectly still, watching him leave. No one ever moved into the house after him. Over the years, the rumors continued to grow. Some said the house was cursed. Others swore they saw lights flickering in the attic window at night. But one thing was certain: whoever or whatever had been in that hidden room was still there, waiting for the next person to uncover its secret. The face in the window lily was a college student living in a small apartment near campus. She had moved in at the start of the semester, excited to have her own space. It was a cozy place with just enough room for her books, bed, and a tiny kitchen. Her classes kept her busy, and most nights she stayed up late studying. One evening, after a long day of classes and work, Lily sat at her desk with a cup of coffee, flipping through her textbooks. The apartment was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional sound of cars outside. The room was dimly lit by her desk lamp, casting shadows on the walls. As she rubbed her tired eyes, she suddenly felt a strange sensation, a prickling at the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. She turned her head slowly toward the window, and her heart nearly stopped. A pale, gaunt face was staring at her from the darkness outside. The eyes were hollow, the skin stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. For a moment, Lily couldn't move either. Fear locked her in place. Then, with a gasp, she reached for her phone. Her hands shook as she fumbled to dial 911. But before she could press call, she forced herself to glance back at the window. The face was gone. Lily rushed to the window and peered outside. There was nothing, just the dark street below and the faint glow of a street lamp. Her heart pounded as she locked the window and pulled the curtains shut. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no signs of anyone lurking outside. The officers assured her that it was probably a drunk passerby or a prankster, but Lily wasn't convinced. Something about that face was off, unnatural. That night, she barely slept. Every little noise made her jump. The wind rattled the window, and she swore she heard footsteps outside her door. But morning came, and with the light of day, she convinced herself that maybe the police were right. Maybe it had just been her imagination. But then, strange things started happening. A few days later, she noticed that objects in her apartment were not where she had left them. Her textbooks, which she always stacked neatly on her desk, were suddenly in a messy pile. Her coffee cup, which she distinctly remembered placing in the sink, was back on the table. At first, she thought she was just forgetful, but it kept happening. Then, one night, she woke up feeling cold. She sat up and looked around, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Her gaze drifted to the window. It was open. Lily was sure she had locked it before going to bed. A shiver ran down her spine as she got up and shut it again, double-checking the lock. She told herself it must have been a mistake, that maybe she hadn't closed it properly. But deep down, she felt something was terribly wrong. Determined to find out what was happening, she decided to set up a camera facing the window. If someone was messing with her, she would catch them in the act. She placed the camera on her desk, angled it just right, and went to bed, hoping for answers. The next morning, she woke up with a sense of dread. She turned on her laptop and played the footage. At first, nothing happened. The hours ticked by in silence. But then, around 3 a.m., movement. A shadow appeared at the window. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she watched. The figure was back, the same gaunt face, the same hollow eyes. He stood there for what felt like forever, just watching. Then, slowly, he reached out and tried to open the window. Her blood ran cold. The lock held, but he didn't leave right away. He stood there for hours, watching her sleep. Lily felt sick. Her hands trembled as she shut her laptop. This was real. Someone was watching her. Someone had been trying to get inside. Without hesitation, she called her landlord and the police again. The officers searched the area once more, but found no signs of forced entry. They suggested she stay somewhere else for a few days while they investigated. Lily didn't need to be told twice. She packed a bag and went to stay with her friend, Emma. At Emma's place, Lily finally felt a little safer, but the paranoia didn't leave her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that face. Every time she passed a window, she felt the urge to look, terrified that she would see him again. After a few days, she returned to her apartment, hoping the worst was over. But when she walked inside, she immediately knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, suffocating. And then she saw it. Her window was open again. The camera was gone. That was the last straw. Lily grabbed her essentials, called her landlord to break the lease, and moved out the next day. She found a new place with better security, far from campus. She never found out who the man was or what he wanted. But she knew one thing. He had been watching her for longer than she realized, and he had wanted to get in. Lily never looked back. The stalker in the attic, David, had always been a quiet man. He lived alone in a small house in a peaceful neighborhood with his loyal dog, Max. Life was simple. Work, home, take Max for a walk, and maybe watch some TV before bed. He had lived in the house for a few years and never had any problems. Until one strange night changed everything. It started as a normal evening. David had just finished dinner and was watching a movie on his couch. Max was curled up beside him, dozing off. The only sounds in the house were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Then, suddenly, David heard something unusual, a faint creaking noise from above. He paused the movie and listened carefully. Silence. He shrugged it off. Old houses make noises. It was probably just the wood settling. He unpaused the movie and tried to relax. But then it happened again. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone was shifting their weight on a wooden floor. David glanced at Max, who was now awake, ears perked up. The dog had heard it too. David felt a chill run down his spine. Was there someone in the attic? He shook his head. No, that was impossible. He had lived here for years and never even used the attic. The only things up there were old boxes and dust. Still, he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling creeping over him. Grabbing a flashlight, he decided to check it out. Max followed him as he made his way to the attic door, which was located in the hallway ceiling. He pulled the cord, and the attic ladder unfolded with a quiet creak. His heart pounded as he climbed up. The attic was dark, except for the beam of his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He scanned the small space. Dust floated in the air. Cobwebs hung from the wooden beams. Nothing seemed out of place, but a horrible smell lingered, something musty and rotten. David frowned. That was strange. Maybe a rat had died up here? He would have to check later. For now, there was no sign of anything unusual. Feeling slightly foolish for being so paranoid, he climbed back down and closed the attic door. He returned to the living room, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Max was still staring at the ceiling, ears twitching. David tried to push the thoughts out of his mind and went to bed. That night, something even stranger happened. David woke up suddenly, his heart racing. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like something was off. The room was dark, and everything was silent. Too silent. Even Max wasn't making a sound. Then he heard it, a soft shuffling noise, like footsteps. His blood ran cold. Someone was in the house. He held his breath, straining to listen. The sound was faint but clear, footsteps moving slowly, carefully. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. David lay frozen in bed, gripping the covers. Was he imagining things? Should he get up and check? He reached for his phone and checked the time, 3:12 a.m. Taking a deep breath, he sat up and listened again. Nothing. After a few minutes, he convinced himself it was just his imagination. Maybe he was dreaming. He lay back down, but it took a long time before he fell asleep again. The next morning, he decided to set up a small motion-activated camera in the hallway, just to be sure. He didn't really expect to find anything, but it would give him peace of mind. That night, he went to bed as usual. He checked the camera before turning off the lights. Everything was normal. Max was snoring quietly on the floor. At 3 o'clock, the camera captured something terrifying. A hidden panel in the attic slowly slid open. A pale hand reached out. Then a figure emerged, a thin man with hollow eyes and unkempt hair. He moved carefully, stepping onto the floor without making a sound. He crept through the hallway, pausing outside David's bedroom door. He stood there for a long time, just watching. Then he moved inside. The man stood at the foot of the bed, staring at David as he slept. His breathing was slow and steady. He reached out but didn't touch him. Instead, he just watched. After a few minutes, he turned and moved through the house. He picked up objects, touched furniture, and even petted Max, who barely stirred in his sleep. Before dawn, the man quietly returned to the attic, sliding the panel back into place. It was as if he had never been there. The next morning, David checked the camera footage. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. He immediately called the police. Officers arrived quickly and searched the attic. What they found was horrifying. The hidden panel led to a small, makeshift living space. There was a thin, dirty mattress, a few empty food wrappers, and a pile of stolen objects. David's missing socks, a kitchen knife, even an old photograph of him from years ago. The man had been living in his attic for weeks, maybe longer, but he was gone. No one knew how he had gotten in. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no unlocked doors. It was as if he had always been there, waiting. David didn't stay in the house after that. He packed up his things and moved out immediately. The thought of someone watching him for so long, living right above him, still haunted him. Even now, in his new home, he sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone is watching. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't the ghosts or monsters we imagine. Sometimes they're real. The whispering shadows Emma had been babysitting for years. She had taken care of children in many houses, big and small, but none of them felt as strange as the old house on Maple Street. It was a tall, narrow house with creaky wooden floors and walls covered in old wallpaper. The house belonged to the Thompson family, who had two children, Lily, 6, and Max, 4. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, were going to a dinner party and wouldn't be back until midnight. When Emma arrived, Mrs. Thompson greeted her warmly. "The kids are already in bed," she said. "They might wake up for water, but they usually sleep through the night. Make yourself at home." Mr. Thompson smiled. "There's food in the fridge if you get hungry." And if you need anything, just call us." Emma nodded and assured them everything would be fine. She had babysat for them before, but something about tonight felt different. The house was colder than usual, and the air felt heavy. She shrugged off the feeling, convincing herself it was just her imagination. A quiet evening turned strange after the Thompsons left. Emma settled on the couch with a book. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, filling the empty space with its rhythmic sound. At around 9 p.m., Emma went to check on the kids. Lily and Max were sound asleep, their soft breathing the only sound in their room. She smiled, tucking them in before heading back downstairs. Time passed slowly. Emma watched some TV, played a game on her phone, and checked the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. when she heard it, a whisper. At first, it was so faint she thought she had imagined it. It sounded like a soft voice coming from the walls. She paused, listening carefully. Maybe it was the wind? But there was no breeze, and the windows were closed. Then, the whispering grew louder. The voices in the walls, Emma's heart began to race. She stood up and looked around. "Hello?" she called out, hoping it was just her mind playing tricks on her. No answer, just more whispering. It didn't sound like just one voice. It sounded like several murmuring words she couldn't understand. She tried to follow the sound, but every time she moved, it seemed to shift, as if it were coming from different parts of the house. Swallowing hard, she decided to check on the kids again. If something was wrong, she needed to make sure they were safe. She climbed the stairs slowly, her ears straining to hear any unusual sounds. The whispering seemed to fade as she reached the children's room. She peeked inside. Lily and Max were still asleep, undisturbed. Relief washed over her, but as she turned to leave, she saw it. A dark figure stood at the end of the hallway. The silent watcher, Emma froze. The figure was barely visible in the dim light, a shadowy shape with no clear features. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Then, the whispers returned, louder this time. Urgent. Snapping out of her daze, she stumbled backward into the children's room and shut the door, locking it. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The call connected, but before she could say anything, the line went dead. Panic surged through her. She tried again, but there was no dial tone. The whispering grew louder, as if the voices were just outside the door. Trapped in fear, Emma turned to the children, who were still peacefully sleeping. She didn't want to wake them, but she also didn't want to stay in the room much longer. If there was someone in the house, she needed to get out. Gathering her courage, she unlocked the door and peeked into the hallway. The figure was gone. The house was silent again, except for her own breathing. She stepped out cautiously, gripping her phone tightly even though it was useless. She needed to get downstairs and find something to defend herself. She crept down the stairs, every step creaking loudly in the stillness. When she reached the living room, she grabbed a heavy fireplace poker. She didn't know what she was up against, but she wasn't going to sit and wait. Then, something moved in the corner of her eye. A shadow flickered near the doorway. She spun around, heart pounding. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. No answer, but the whispers continued. The terrifying discovery time seemed to stretch as she stood there, gripping the poker. Then, suddenly, the front door handle rattled. A wave of relief flooded through her. Maybe the Thompsons were home. The door swung open, and Mr. and Mrs. Thompson stepped inside. "Emma?" Mrs. Thompson said, frowning. "Why are you standing like that?" Emma let out a shaky breath and lowered the poker. There was someone in the house. I saw them. I heard voices. The phone stopped working. Before she could finish, the police arrived. She hadn't even realized she had left the call connected long enough for them to trace it. The officers searched the house thoroughly, but found nothing unusual. Just as Emma started to doubt herself, an officer called out from behind the walls. You might want to see this. Behind a loose panel in the hallway, they found a hidden passage. Inside was a small crawl space, filled with old blankets, food wrappers, and other signs that someone had been living there. The unanswered mystery, the Thompsons were horrified. Who could have been living in our walls? Mr. Thompson asked, his face pale. The police had no answers. There were no signs of forced entry, and they never found the person who had been staying there. Whoever it was had disappeared without a trace. Emma quit babysitting after that night. No matter how many times she told herself it was over, she could still hear the whispers in her dreams. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she wondered if the shadow was still watching.